Good. It will be in English. I hope you've been warned. So thank you very much for having me here in such a wonderful space. It's a pleasure and an honor. I think I will use my 30 minutes to try to give you an overview, a general overview of what I think are some of the main problems, not so much with the internet, digital technology. You know, I'm not technophobic by any means. I'm not a Luddite. I love technology, but rather with the fact that so much of our life, so much of our politics, and so much of our economics is increasingly swallowed and overtaken by a number of technological giants, many of them based in the United States, but quite a few of them increasingly based in China. Right? And I think it's very important from the beginning for you to note that there are no European companies at all featured in this lament you're going to hear for the next 30 minutes, and that there are good reasons to worry that there is no European company represented in this lament. So for those of you who are not following the technology sector closely, let me just give you a couple of statistics which might situate you a little bit better in what's going on. So if you look at just 5 big American technology firms that all of you are probably using on a daily basis, speaking about Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. So if you look at how much their stock valuations, right, what they're worth on the stock exchange, how much their stock valuations have grown over the last year, 2017, you will see that they have added more than $1 trillion to their valuations, right, in just 12 months. Which also means that people who have invested in those firms have become by $1 trillion richer, essentially. Yes? Amidst the economic crisis and amidst all of the problems we're discussing, this sector is making quite a lot of people rich. The same can be observed in China, where just, if you look at 2 largest firms, by Alibaba and Tencent, they themselves, just 2 of them, have added more than $500 billion in value, right, over 12 months. We're not talking about absolute numbers, we're talking about what they have added to their stock valuation in just 12 months of 2017. Now, we've been in a similar situation before, some of you might say, in 1999, and that had led to a bubble. Right? It led us to essentially a situation where all those stock markets crashed, making quite a lot of people poor, and eventually slowing down the global economy and having a lot of devastating consequences. I think that given where we are now, that would be our good case scenario. That bubble would burst and we'll go back to normal. I think the more likely scenario is that that bubble is not going to burst for quite some time, and that the growing and rapidly increasing valuations of those firms actually reflect the growing importance to how the rest of the world works. And it reflects, to some extent, the centrality of their business models and the centrality of the data that they have produced with those models, and the centrality of artificial intelligence that they have built with that data to how the rest of society would work and function. For it's mostly by artificial intelligence and its deployment in various fields that we currently hope to resolve some of our most fundamental problems. If you listen to politicians in Europe, but also in America, it would seem that it's precisely through the deployment of artificial intelligence systems built by those firms that would be able to solve problems related to problems as diverse as fake news, cybersecurity, energy efficiency, healthcare, and so forth. And you'll find plenty of examples, even not even living Italy, with companies that I haven't even mentioned, like IBM, striking deals with your local administrations in Lombardy, for example, to analyze health data, and by using AI to generate certain insights and efficiencies in how the public system, healthcare system in this case, works. So it is through AI, it's through artificial intelligence, that The centrist politicians, whoever of them is still standing, hope to really resolve some of the most profound crises, many of them having to do, of course, with the field skill crisis and the inability to finance healthcare and education and many of the other domains anymore. And it's through artificial intelligence that those problems will be plugged, which explains to you, I think, from the very beginning, why there is this natural alliance within many of these tech firms and the political class, and the political elites, if you will, which I think is best of all represented by the fact that just a few days ago, Emmanuel Macron made this very big announcement in the company of the executives of Facebook and Google, luring them essentially to start doing more business in France and inviting them to open big artificial intelligence campuses in the country. Now, let me step back a little bit from this contemporary situation and explain to you how I view what has happened with the digital economy in the last 10 years. Because I think it's very important that we understand that it's not a fixed thing, that essentially there are dynamics to it. Some of those dynamics are connected to the inherent competition between those firms. Some of them are connected to the availability of funds to fund things like artificial intelligence. Some of them are connected to just normal dynamics of capitalist competition. Okay? So let me expand a little bit on what I think has happened in the last 10 years, because it will help us understand why I'm not very optimistic about the future, dominated by these big technology firms. So I would argue that the reason why we have developed such a positive outlook upon this industry from the very beginning is because its interests, to some extent, were well aligned with our own interests, as users. If you look at the business models of companies like Amazon and Google, from the very beginning, they kind of assumed that consumers and citizens have to have some income, need to have some paycheck in order to be able to actually buy all the products that are being advertised and to actually, consume things. Because if that economy falls apart, right, you would ultimately have very little advertising and you will have no goods sold on Amazon. So to some extent, a charitable comparison might be to Henry Ford, right, who wanted to pay his workers higher wages so they could actually afford to buy his own cars. The technology industry, to some extent, is a little bit bizarre because they do want somebody to play the role of Henry Ford, right? So they actually want us to have more money to spend on all those goods we might be buying from them, but they don't want to be the ones paying us higher salaries or funding even some of the social contributions that we might be getting from the state or other sources. So in Silicon Valley now, you have a lot of supporters of universal basic income, so a lot of venture capitalists are lining up behind this idea, but very few of them actually are willing to put their own money to fund basic income as such, right? Which tells you all you need to know about how serious they are about this rhetoric of compassion that they occasionally tap into. Now, despite the fact that there was this alignment of interests between our needs and theirs, they've also been liked by us for a very simple reason that because they were driven by advertising and shopping, right, they were willing to offer us all sorts of free services and all sorts of cheap services and discounts in order to accumulate our data. Right? In the case of Google and Facebook, that relationship was very simple and linear. The more data they had about us, the more efficient advertising they could sell to the advertisers. So the more they knew about me and what I wanted and where I went, right, the more efficient and the higher are the rates that they could have charged for advertising. So this is how they started accumulating as much data about us as possible. The use for that data was very simple. As I've said, it was in the case of Google to show us more relevant ads, and in the case of Amazon, it was to basically recommend us more relevant products. Right? There was no other use to that data from the very beginning of the business model. But you have to understand that something happened around 2009, 2008. Until then, these companies dominated their particular niche, right? So you had Google dominating search and advertising, you had Facebook dominating social networking, you had Amazon dominating online shopping, And there was kind of very little competition between all of them, right? Which made a lot of us think that these firms are actually monopolies and that they control their own sector and there is very little competition between them and you should really step in and do something about it. However, something changed, as I've said, around 2008, 2009. First of all, companies like Amazon start realizing that in the process of building their capacity of selling so many goods, they have a lot of spare resources, right? So Amazon understood that they have a lot of servers that they're not using for anything, and they've decided to start renting out the capacity of those servers to essentially anybody who needed it. This is how they entered the cloud computing business, right? Which has become one of the most profitable, in terms of profit margins, business activities for them. So Amazon has a lot of computer infrastructure, and they decided that, hey, we can just be renting out that infrastructure and making money from things other than selling goods. And not only that, we can actually earn more from that than we do from conventional shopping, which now became a huge line of activity for Amazon. It accounts for their web services division. Okay? So this is one thing. It's companies entering the services sector from which they were previously absent, right? And it's driven by a very different logic than selling as advertising or selling as products. It's essentially a business-to-business relationship, with them selling services to governments and them selling services to other companies. Now, something else happened in around 2009, 2008, and it was the discovery, or the rediscovery, of a very different mode of operating artificial intelligence. For those of you who know the field, I can say there was a shift from what you might call symbolic AI to AI driven by neural networks. All you need to know about this transition is that we moved from a system that sought to specify a lot of rules, right? Sought to specify a lot of algorithms, if this then that, if that then this, right? Which is how we traditionally thought about AI. We saw that you need to specify all the rules in advance, and if you put too many rules into the system and you formalize them, you will have something matching human intelligence. Around 2008, 2009, a breakthrough was made. Partially, people were working on this for many, many years, but the breakthrough was made where we realized that you don't actually need to specify those rules. You can just take a lot of data, throw it at the system, and have the system learn by itself by identifying similarities and structures in that data. And once those similarities and structures in the data have been identified, you can actually build some kind of a service whereby if you throw more similar data into the system, it will be able to classify it in one way or another. Right? Which basically what gave us all of the advances in artificial intelligence of the last 8 or 9 years. Recognizing objects, recognizing voice, building cars that can recognize other cars in front of them, building systems that can translate from one language to another much better and much faster. Virtually all of it is underpinned by the same breakthrough in artificial intelligence. It's the idea that the data that you have can be repurposed for some other point, for some other purpose. Can be used to train your system to become smarter, and then if you are yourself very smart as a businessman, you would be able to build some kind of a service around that AI that you have built with the data. Right? And I think we should not underestimate and what has happened with all of these firms, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and a few others. They have realized that the data they were collecting for the purposes of essentially selling advertising and improving our shopping experience can also be used to build self-driving cars, to build systems that can help us optimize energy use, to build systems that can essentially cure cancer, and do a lot of other things. Right? And all of a sudden we discovered that they're the ones who own the data, they're the ones who have millions and billions to spend on improving it and building those AI services. And we are slowly entering a world where most of these companies start offering services like the one I've described in the case of Amazon. Amazon discovered they had a lot of server power and they could just rent it out. So all of them are embracing this model, only that what they're renting out is their ability to do this advanced artificial intelligence operations. recognize voice, classify images, recognize faces in images, do all sorts of advanced operations which become possible once you have a lot of data and you've built a lot of models using that data, for which, by the way, everybody has to pay. So we are no longer in the economy where things and activities were subsidized, which is what the digital economy was up until 2009, 2010. Right? We all remember a lot of books published around 2007, 2008, which were telling us that everything was becoming free. Right? Remember, it was a very big book by Chris Anderson, then the editor of the Wired magazine, which basically said that things are becoming free because these companies have found a way to essentially offer us free products and free services in exchange for our data, right? Or in exchange for something else, but ultimately you could have this hidden subsidy built into the system and everybody could profit from it. There have been actually quite a few studies. The most recent one was done at MIT that last year that tried to quantify how much it is that we are actually profiting from getting to use Google and Facebook and Google Video and YouTube for free. Because ultimately none of us are paying for these things yet, right? So we're generating some value from us. And in that particular study, they conducted an experiment where they asked people how much they would need to get paid not to use Google, not to use Facebook, and not to use YouTube for a year. Right? And I think the number they arrived at eventually was something around 17,000, 18,000 euros. And this is what was the rough estimate of people in the United States and Western Europe. Right? Which of course might be overstated. I know a lot of young people in Italy will accept a much lower sum not to use any of those services. But nonetheless, I think it points us in a very interesting direction. That much of what we take for granted about digital society and digital economy has been funded and subsidized by someone else. It was not subsidized by our taxes. It was not subsidized by our fees. It was subsidized by the process of what I call data extractivism, right? Which aimed at extracting as much data as possible from us, the users, and doing it by all sorts of rather tricky and sinister means. You know, this is why now we're talking about addiction to social media, right? We actually have a lot of engineers from Silicon Valley coming out and saying that after 15 years, they have realized they've been building the next generation of drugs, essentially, which are designed and engineered to make themselves addictive, right? So I'm talking, of course, about social media and Twitter and the rest of it, but they were engineered like that with almost an industrial goal in mind. And the goal in mind was to maximize the number of clicks, because by maximizing the number of clicks, you maximize how much data you extract from every single user. Right? So this system of data extractivism, which has been more or less running since the beginning of this advertising-driven digital economy, has had quite a lot of rather negative consequences to society at large. And you can, of course, incorporate things like fake news into this analysis quite easily, because ultimately it's the existence of these channels that reward clicks and that reward eyeballs that results in the proliferation of fake news. Right? It's not the fact that fake news is published, they've always been published. It's the fact that now they get the scale, and they get the scale precisely because they have a system that is underwritten by this logic of data extractivism. Right? Just that previously data extractivism was there to maximize how much data extracted to sell advertising, and now data extractivism is there to extract the data to train the AI systems. And I think we have to be prepared towards the end. And what is the end? The end is that, you know, despite hearing on almost a daily basis that data is like the new oil, I think it's actually a misleading metaphor. Because ultimately, you do need oil and you do need energy in order to power your economy and to power, you know, consumption and to transportation and many other things. Data you only need for a very limited period of time until you actually train the AI systems. And once you've trained your AI systems good enough, there is no need for that data, and by consequence, by extension, there is no need for you as the provider of it. Okay? So in a sense, you're looking at a limited period of time of the next 5, 7, 10 years, where there will still be some need to extract more and more data from us. But let me assure you that most of you are relatively boring and predictable, and after 5 years of monitoring you quite closely, you do not produce any data that will justify offering you services for which you can be charging 20,000 euros a month or a year, right? You understand where I'm going with this? And ultimately, many of the positive features of the digital economy and digital society that we took for granted, because we assumed that, hey, as the welfare state gets defunded and finds itself under conditions of austerity, we can have the digital economy take over and subsidize a lot of things for us and offer to us all of those, things, search, social networking, and so forth, which many businesses profited from, not just consumers. All of that has a very uncertain future in a world where even companies themselves are increasingly shifting their activities from consumer-facing advertising and shopping to business-facing services built around AI. Right? And that sooner or later, this utopian paradise we have built that assumes that these companies will be caring for us forever, and they will be benevolent, and they will be offering us things for free. I think that's an assumption that requires some rethinking and some rethought. And if it requires some rethought, then the question should be, can we have an alternative society? Can we have an alternative model where we don't end up with all of the negative consequences of data extractivism, some of which, like fake news or addiction, I have already mentioned, where we also wouldn't be building this immense system of inequality where the immense growth of the stock of those firms makes 10 or 15 or 20 investors behind them the richest people on earth, while the rest of us is left with very little economic activity to pursue and very little to expect even from our wealth institutions. Right? I'm sure you've noticed that it's no longer even Bill Gates who's the richest man on earth. It's, as of a few months ago, it's actually Jeff Bezos. Okay? So you see immense concentration of power and resources in the hands of these companies. And things, I think, will only get worse for us, the users, as this window of free and subsidized stuff closes. You can make the same case and the same story about Uber, even though in the case of Uber, the narrative would be somewhat different. Okay? There is still a lot of people who are quite happy to celebrate Uber as a service that is very efficient and very slick. I fully agree with that. That is also very cheap. Okay? And in this case, you have to start asking yourself a question: how on earth is it so cheap? And the reason why it's so cheap partially has to do with the fact that it's so heavily funded by, on the one hand, venture capitalists, and on the other hand, by really big institutional investors like Japan's SoftBank, that they can afford to be losing billions and billions of dollars every year, because losing those dollars allows them to offer a rise at trades that are very low, destroy the local competition, and then, after there is nobody standing to compete with them, either to raise prices, to recoup the money they've lost and pay it back to investors, or hope that in the next 3-4 years, they have managed to crack the magic of self-driving cars and entirely replace the drivers with algorithms and AI, and thus minimize the labor expenses. That way you will be able to preserve the rates where they are now without having to raise them. Anybody who spent any time looking at the actual numbers of Uber will know that there is no other way. There is no way for them to become profitable and to actually return the billions that SoftBank and many other investors poured into them, including, by the way, the government of Saudi Arabia, Goldman Sachs. It's a very big pool of people who give them money. There is no way to return that money without either raising the fares or, on the other hand, actually getting rid of all the drivers, right? And I don't know the figures for Italy. I can tell you that in America there are only 3.5 million truck drivers. Okay? Those are people driving trucks, and their jobs will be automated in the next 5-7 years. Partially, again, because of advances in artificial intelligence, because of advances in object recognition. So, every time you search for something on Google, and Google suspects you might be a robot, okay? It shows you this little thing. It shows you a photo and asks you to tick all the cars, or to tick all the bridges, or to tick all the street signs, right? I'm sure that many of you have experienced that. Google basically asks you to prove that you're not a robot. That every time you fill it in, you are the one essentially training Google's AI systems to recognize objects. Right? That essentially, if you happen to be a truck driver who's been asked to prove that they're not a robot, by doing that, you're essentially automating yourself out of existence. Okay? So it's not very reassuring news. But alas, this is how most of our digital economy works. And in the case of fighting spam and filling in those captchas, it's a very obvious example, but I can assure you that in the course of using digital technology on a daily basis, you're training those AI systems in ways that you yourself do not realize, because you are not the one building those systems with their particular logics and rationales of training AI and extracting your data. So we have no clue what it is we are doing once we're clicking on like on Facebook. Like, you know that you're liking something, but you don't know what algorithms and AI systems you're training in the result, in the process of doing that, right? Which is not very reassuring. There are, of course, many other connections I can draw here, depending on how far you want to go into analyzing contemporary capitalism, because I would also challenge this idea that we are facing some kind of digital capitalism that stands outside of the financial capitalism of some kind. Just to give you one example, so Uber has raised probably close to $9 or $10 billion from this largest company in Japan called SoftBank. Right? So SoftBank has a fund called Vision Fund, which has $100 billion to invest into technology startups. And they're about to start another one, which might actually be much more than that, might be $200 billion. Where does SoftBank gets the money? Right? SoftBank goes and borrows the money. Their debt level is $120 billion. So they actually are in debt much more than what they invest. And because we are living through a time of very low interest rates, which in Japan have been low for 2 decades, they are actually able to raise money very cheaply, invest in the companies like Uber, that then destroy all the local competition, suck out all of the resources from the local economy, and make people behind SoftBank very, very rich. So in fact, its founder and chairman is the richest person in Japan. And the same story can be told about Saudi Arabia, which we tend to think as some kind of feudal regime, which nonetheless is one of the investors behind many of those tech firms, and it's essentially money sucked out of the taxi drivers and taxi firms in Italy that is funding the purchases of Leonardo da Vinci paintings by the sheikhs in Saudi Arabia. Right? And I mean, that's just mathematically so. Like, I'm not making any anti-whatever foreign or xenophobic statement. So let me just say a few words before we wrap up about where I see some light, if any, in this rather dark environment where we become, if it's not clear to you by now what I'm saying, essentially I'm arguing that we're becoming the online surplus population of these firms. There is very little need that they have in us. Now they still need to sell us goods and show us ads. At a time when the primary customer becomes the government or the firms, they don't really care what happens to us. Right? So they can charge us, Facebook will be happy to offer you a product. We will actually have to pay for Facebook to protect you from fake news or to protect you from addictive technologies. Right? They'll send you some kind of mental yoga as a service solution. Right? And they'll charge you, and they'll be more than happy to do it because you are not their primary market anymore, and you will not be. Because the money they can make elsewhere, by fighting fake news, by fighting cancer, by fighting climate change, is far more than even what they could make by selling ads. Okay? It's one problem for them, it's one thing for them to worry about whether you can afford a pair of sneakers, right, which they advertise to you. And it's another thing for them to be the indispensable, too big to fail industry, which every politician needs. Again, look to Emmanuel Macron, look to Justin Trudeau, and even here look at Renzi, who was more than happy to open AI centers of Amazon and other firms near Turin and other places. So that's the reality that we face, and I think the only solution that I see on the horizon is, instead of breaking up those firms, which is the kind of utopian impulse that many of us have inherited from the 1930s and 1920s, especially in the United States, where you had big oil companies broken up. I think we have to understand that in many respects, data is not like oil, as I have already told you. That essentially, with oil, it doesn't matter whether you have 1 barrel of it, or 5 barrels of it, or 10 barrels of it, it's the same oil in every single container. With data, it's not like that. The more data you have, and the more different kinds you have it, the more powerful your insights. So, to some extent, you don't want to break the providers and collectors of information into 100 different companies instead of having just one. Right? Instead, what we want to do is to put as much data, de-anonymized, so we take care of the privacy issues, de-anonymized, but nonetheless you want to put it together, right? And then find a way in which you can change the ownership structure and the ownership regime behind that data, so that data does not just belong to companies that harvest it, they might also belong to individuals, might belong to municipalities, might belong to nation states, might belong to citizen associations of all kinds, right? And on top of that data, you can then build a very different society and a very different economy, where you would actually be incentivizing small players, entrepreneurs, NGOs, citizen associations to come and build things on that data for free. You might even give them a grant to do something with it. While big firms like Amazon and Google and Apple and Microsoft will actually have to pay a fee, which will then fuel, our tax system and will be passed on to the customers and those NGOs and everybody else. That's how it should be done. This company should be paying us for the data they collect and not vice versa. That's any reasonable analysis of this after you draw all the connections would suggest that we are the sources of value for them, just like, the tax that were translated as our tax money for the United Nations and for the European Parliament are the ingredients that allows Google to radically improve its Google translation system. Right? They don't have to pay those costs because they can free ride on costs that have already been borne by us. That's how they can offer a fantastic translation service. Now they even offer that translation service not just to you as an individual, that offer it as a service, commercial service to businesses. Do you think it's reasonable that you with your taxes have paid for some translator to sit in Brussels and translate all sorts of documents from German to French and from French to Spanish, for Google just to come in and appropriate the data because it's in public domain, train its AI systems, and then build a service which they can then sell to others with essentially contributions that all of us have funded. Right? And I think that's essentially the trick at the heart of the digital economy we do not understand. So if you want to get rid of that trick, we have to find a way to own that data differently, to regulate access to that data, to encourage some types of access, discourage other types of access, and then to match it with a robust, proactive, aggressive strategy, industrial strategy and funding strategy, which will allow us to build systems of artificial intelligence, building on immense talent that we still have in Europe in many universities, that will actually be able to compete with AI systems that have already been built by those firms. Because if we just leave it at the question of data, and we find a way to reclaim a data, which would be a huge start, if you were to ask me, we would still be behind. Because at this point, data does not really matter, because data is needed by those firms, by and large, to build AI systems, which in many cases they have already built. Okay? So again, it's a very ambitious agenda. I can talk to you later on about what's going to happen if we don't undertake it. I don't think that, given where things are going now, we'll see any decrease in inequality related also to accumulation of this precious resource data in the hands of just a few firms. I also don't think we are doing ourselves any favor by delegating more and more responsibilities over things that were previously under democratic control to these big companies. It's not obvious to me why a company using AI should be in charge of determining what counts as true and what counts as fake. It's not obvious to me at all why that should be the process, as opposed to, if you've broken any laws, you should take it to courts. If you think that a law has been broken by somebody publishing false information, it's up to our legal system and up to judges, and not up to algorithms, and not up to some geek sitting in California to decide whether a law has been broken or not. Right? And the fact that on almost every domain of society, from journalism to communication to healthcare to energy to transportation to so forth, we delegate more and more power to these private actors who have zero democratic oversight in most cases. To me, it's a disturbing thing. Right? And the fact that Europe has very little to advertise when it comes to data or AI on its own is an even more disturbing thing. And I think that to wrap up, I would just like to say that if nothing is done to reverse that trend in Europe at the level of the European Commission, but also the level of individual nation states, you're looking essentially at the emergence of a new form of technocolonialism. Right? And I don't think it's a strong word, actually think it's a weak word, because ultimately at this point, Europe finds itself in a situation where its only hope for the future in this world heavily dominated by AI is to play America against China. There's no other option left. You can say, okay, we're not going to go with Google for the provision of our AI, we're going to go with Baidu. We're not going to go with Tencent, we're going to go with Facebook. You know, to some extent, it might pay off for a while, assuming that you're going to have coordination at the level of European nation states. You're never going to have it. Just like you don't have it on taxation, it's just like you're not going to have it on industrial policy, where, you know, everybody would like to play those firms against each other, and then you have Emmanuel Macron announcing another deal with Facebook and Google because they promised to invest in France. Right? So I don't think it's a sustainable strategy, and I think that short of doing that, Europe will find itself in its industry heavily dependent on services that will be key to keeping them competitive. You know, think about what's going to happen to German car industry, which, you know, has had a lot of also possibly damaging impact on Europe, environmentally, financially. Just think about what's going to happen to it once the main kind of asset of the car stops being its hardware but becomes its AI. Okay? The entire kind of German ecosystem is built on manufacturing very good, solid cars. Right? But they have no ecosystem for building very good, solid AI. And if AI in cars is powered out of China or out of the United States, why on earth would most of your money that you pay for your Mercedes or BMW go to the Germans and not to the Americans or to the Chinese? Okay? So, again, it's something that I think we need to be aware of, but without putting this geopolitical aspect on the table, I think you're never going to build a coalition that will allow you to actually implement some of these changes that I've been advocating. Because ultimately here, it's not just a concern of activists. It's not just a concern of some kind of crazy radical leftists. Like here, if you don't do this, you will have your entire economy and the entire industry heavily dependent on one sector. So you can think whatever you want about fake news, journalism, liberalism, and so forth. Like the actual economic base on which economy and society is being restructured, okay, and the technological layer of that base is no longer under the control of most European states and let alone European institutions. Right? And I think without realizing it and highlighting it as a geopolitical issue, you're never going to have the level of urgency needed to actually push for some of those changes. And without pushing for them, I think we'll find ourselves in a very dire situation where governments have assumed that technology companies will take care of the users. Technology companies have discovered they have far more profitable areas to pursue, and we end up essentially on our own, fending for our own interests, short of resources, and discovering that we have an addiction to many of the services that we do not even know how to beat. And so that's the kind of dark dystopian future with which I would like to leave you. And if there are any questions, perhaps we can address them later on in the Q&A. Thank you very much.